Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. Straddling the top of the world, one foot in China and the other in Nepal, I cleared the ice from my oxygen mask, hunched a shoulder against the wind, and stared absently down at the vastness of Tibet. I understood, on some dim, detached level, that the sweep of earth beneath my feet was a spectacular sight. I'd been fantasizing about this moment and the release of emotion that would accompany it for many months. But now that I was finally here, actually standing on the summit of Mount Everest, I just couldn't summon the energy to care. It was early in the afternoon of May 10th, 1986. I hadn't slept in 57 hours. The only food I'd been able to force down over the preceding 3 days was a bowl of ramen soup and a handful of peanut M&Ms. Weeks of violent coughing had left me with 2 separated ribs that made ordinary breathing an excruciating trial. At 29,028 feet up in the troposphere, so little oxygen was reaching my brain that my mental capacity was that of a slow child. Under the circumstances, I was incapable of feeling much of anything except cold and tired. I'd arrived on the summit a few minutes after Antonelli Bukreev, a Russian climbing guide working for an American commercial expedition, and just ahead of Andy Harris, a guide on the New Zealand-based team to which I belonged. Although I was only slightly acquainted with Bukreev, I'd come to know and like Harris well during the preceding 6 weeks. I snapped 4 quick photos of Harris and Bukreev striking summit poses, then turned and headed down. My watch read 1:17 p.m. All told, I'd spent less than 5 minutes on the roof of the world. A moment later, I paused to take another photo, this one looking down the southeast ridge, the route we had ascended. Training my lens on a pair of climbers approaching the summit, I noticed something that until that moment had escaped my attention. To the south, where the sky had been perfectly clear just an hour earlier, a blanket of clouds now hid Pumori, Ama, Dablan, and the other lesser peaks surrounding Everest. Later, after 6 bodies had been located, after a search for 2 others had been abandoned, after surgeons had amputated the gangrenous right hand of my teammate Beck Weathers, people would ask why. If the weather had begun to deteriorate, had climbers on the upper mountain not heeded the signs? Why did veteran Himalayan guides keep moving upward, ushering a gaggle of relatively inexperienced amateurs, each of whom had paid as much as $65,000 to be taken safely up Everest into an apparent death trap? Nobody can speak for the leaders of the 2 guided groups involved, because both men are dead. But I can attest that nothing I saw early on the afternoon of May 10th suggested that a murderous storm was bearing down. To my oxygen-depleted mind, the clouds drifting up the grand valley of ice known as the Western Cwm looked innocuous, wispy, insubstantial. Gleaming in the brilliant midday sun, they appeared no different from the harmless puffs of convection condensation that rose from the valley almost every afternoon. As I began my descent, I was extremely anxious, but my concern had little to do with the weather. A check of the gauge on my oxygen tank had revealed that it was almost empty. I needed to get down, fast. The utmost shank of Everest's south ridge is a slender, heavily corniced fin of rock and wind-scoured snow that snakes for a quarter mile between the summit and the subordinate pinnacle known as the South Summit. Negotiating the serrated ridges presents no great technical hurdles, but the route is dreadfully exposed. After leaving the summit, 15 minutes of cautious shuffling over a 7,000-foot abyss brought me to the notorious Hillary Step, a pronounced notch in the ridge that demands some technical maneuvering. As I clipped into the fixed rope and prepared to rappel over the lip, I was greeted with an alarming sight. 30 feet below, more than a dozen people were queued up at the base of the step. 3 climbers were already in the process of hauling themselves up the rope that I was preparing to descend. Exercising my only option, I unclipped from the communal safety line and stepped aside. The traffic jam was comprised of climbers from 3 expeditions. The team I belonged to, a group of paying clients under the leadership of the celebrated New Zealand guide Rob Hall, another guided party headed by the American Scott Fisher, and a non-commercial Taiwanese team. Moving at a snail's pace, that is the norm above 26,000 feet, the throng labored up the Hillary step one by one, while I nervously bided my time. Harris, who'd left the summit shortly after I did, soon pulled up behind me. Wanting to conserve whatever oxygen remained in my tank, I asked him to reach inside my backpack and turn off the valve on my regulator, which he did. For the next 10 minutes, I felt surprisingly good. My head cleared. I actually seemed less tired than I had with the gas turned on. Then, abruptly, I sensed that I was suffocating. My vision dimmed, and my head began to spin. I was on the brink of losing consciousness. Instead of turning my oxygen off, Harris, in his hypoxically impaired state, had mistakenly cranked the valve open to full flow, draining the tank. I just squandered the last of my gas going nowhere. There was another tank waiting for me at the south summit, 250 feet below. But to get there, I would have to descend the most exposed terrain on the entire route without the benefit of supplemental oxygen. And first, I had to wait for the mob to disperse. I removed my now useless mask, placing my ice axe into the mountain's frozen hide, and hunkered on the ridge. As I exchanged banal conversations with the climbers filing past, inwardly, I was frantic. Hurry it up, hurry up, I silently pleaded. While you guys are fucking around, I'm losing brain cells by the millions. Most of the passing crowd belonged to Fisher's group, but near the back of the parade, 2 of my teammates eventually appeared, Rob Hall and Yasuko Namba. Demure and reserved, the 47-year-old Namba was 40 minutes away from being the oldest woman to climb Everest and the second Japanese woman to reach the highest point on each continent, the so-called 7 summits. Although she weighed just 91 pounds, her sparrow-like proportions disguised a formidable resolve. To an astounding degree, Yasuka had been propelled up the mountain by the unwavering intensity of her desire. Later still, Doug Hansen arrived atop the step. Another member of our expedition, Doug was a postal worker from a Seattle suburb who'd become my closest friend on the mountain. It's in the bag, I yelled over the wind, trying to sound more upbeat than I felt. Exhausted, Doug mumbled something from behind his oxygen mask that I didn't catch, shook my hand weakly, and continued plodding upward. At the very end of the line was Scott Fisher, whom I knew casually from Seattle, where we both lived. Fisher's strength and drive was legendary. In 1994, he'd climbed Everest without using bottled oxygen. So I was surprised at how slowly he was moving and how hammered he looked when he pulled his mask aside to say hello. Bruce! He wheezed with forced cheer, employing his trademark frat boyish greeting. When I asked how he was doing, Fisher insisted that he was feeling fine. Just dragging a little today for some reason. No big deal. With the Hillary step finally clear, I clipped into the strand of orange rope, swung quickly around Fisher as he slumped over his ice axe, and rappelled over the edge. It was after 3 o'clock when I made it down to the south summit. By now, tendrils of mist were streaming over the 27,923-foot top of Los and lapping at Everest's summit pyramid. No longer did the weather look so benign. I grabbed a fresh oxygen cylinder, jammed it into my regulator, and hurried down into the gathering cloud. Moments after I dropped below the south summit, it began to snow lightly, and visibility went to hell. 400 vertical feet above, where the summit was still washed in bright sunlight under an immaculate cobalt sky, my compadres dallied to memorialize their arrival at the apex of the planet. unfurling flags and snapping photos, using up precious ticks of the clock. None of them imagined that a horrible ordeal was drawing nigh. Nobody suspected that by the end of that long day, every minute would matter.